Nobody expected 50 Cent to be the one to crack this door open. And that's exactly why the moment hit so hard. When whispers began circulating about a Netflix documentary teasing uncomfortable overlaps between powerful figures, fans assumed it would be another glossy industry retrospective. What they didn't expect was a narrative turn that dragged faith, fame, and long-buried proximity into the same frame, and then let 50 do what he does best: question the silence. Because this wasn't delivered like a rumor. It wasn't framed like a tabloid claim. It arrived as context, carefully cut, deliberately paced, and positioned to make viewers ask questions that don't come with easy answers. According to early viewers, the documentary doesn't accuse, it connects. Timelines, rooms, relationships. Moments that once felt separate suddenly sit side by side, inviting the audience to notice patterns they may have never questioned before. And once those patterns appear on screen, they don't disappear when the credits roll. That's where the shock landed. Because when a project linked to Netflix places cultural power under a microscope, it carries a different weight. It's not a tweet. It's not a podcast clip. It's a curated narrative that says, "Look again." And when that look again involves figures as different and as influential as T.D. Jakes and Sean Combs, the discomfort multiplies. Viewers say the most unsettling part isn't any single moment. It's the juxtaposition. Public sermons about morality and private industry spaces about access. Spiritual authority and entertainment power sharing timelines that were never meant to be interrogated together. The film reportedly doesn't claim wrongdoing. Instead, it raises a far more destabilizing question. What happens when influence overlaps without explanation? And then came 50's reaction. Not a denial, not a confirmation, a challenge. Fans watched as 50 framed the documentary's implications the way only he can, by spotlighting the gaps. The pauses, the years no one asked about, the rooms everyone pretended were unrelated. He didn't say this happened. He said, why was this never addressed? And that distinction matters because it shifts the burden from proving a claim to explaining a history. The internet didn't erupt immediately. It leaned in. Clips were replayed, screenshots froze timelines, old photos resurfaced not as proof but as prompts. Why were these worlds closer than people realized? Why did certain associations go unquestioned for so long? Why does revisiting proximity feel threatening now? That's when shock turned into scrutiny. Because proximity isn't a crime, but it becomes controversial when it's selectively remembered. And documentaries don't need to accuse to destabilize. They just need to reframe. Early chatter suggests this project does exactly that, by letting silence do the talking, and by allowing viewers to assemble meaning from what's shown and what's missing. The most explosive element? Timing. This didn't surface in a vacuum. It arrived at a moment when audiences are far less willing to accept no comment as closure. When credibility is tested not by denials but by consistency. When influence, religious or cultural, is expected to answer uncomfortable questions, not deflect them. And with 50 amplifying the conversation, the story stopped being niche. It became inescapable. Because when someone known for exposing industry contradictions points at a narrative gap and says, "Explain this," the culture listens. Not because it believes an accusation, but because it recognizes a pattern of avoidance. This is why fans are stunned. Not because the documentary claims something definitive, but because it suggests the full story may never have been told. And once that possibility settles in, every reaction matters. Every delay matters. Every carefully worded response, or lack of one, becomes part of the evidence people carry forward. This isn't a hit piece. It's a pressure test. And it's only beginning. To understand why this documentary, and 50 Cent's reaction to it, hit such a nerve, you have to understand how separate worlds were never supposed to be examined together. Faith and entertainment, pulpits and power rooms, moral authority and cultural influence. For decades, those lanes were treated as parallel, not intersecting. This project challenges that assumption not by accusing, but by placing timelines side by side and asking viewers to sit with the discomfort. That's the background pressure point. For years, T.D. Jakes has been publicly associated with spiritual leadership, discipline, and guidance, messages designed to rise above industry noise. At the same time, the entertainment world has operated by a very different set of incentives: access, proximity, and influence. Those systems don't usually collide on screen. When they do, it's often sanitized, inspirational, or symbolic. This documentary does something different. According to early discussions, it reorders context. It doesn't allege wrongdoing. it doesn't make claims it can't support. Instead, it highlights overlap, shared spaces, shared eras, shared proximity, and lets the audience ask why those overlaps were never part of the public conversation. The power of that move isn't in what's said, it's in what's newly visible. And visibility changes everything. The project's association with Netflix matters here. Netflix documentaries don't arrive as whispers, they arrive as curated narratives with reach and permanence. Viewers don't watch them casually, they watch them expecting coherence. So when a film introduces sequences that connect faith leadership with entertainment power, the audience assumes intention. They assume there's a reason this is being shown now. That assumption fuels scrutiny. Central to the background is the long, complicated history of Sean Combs's influence in entertainment, rooms where access mattered, where reputations were shaped by proximity, and where alliances were often opaque. The documentary reportedly doesn't accuse anyone within that orbit. Instead, it reframes the era by showing who was present, when and how often, and then steps back. Stepping back is strategic, because once viewers notice patterns, they don't need narration to feel unsettled. They start connecting dots on their own. Old photos, event appearances, cross-industry initiatives. None of these elements are new individually. What's new is their arrangement, presented together without the usual buffer of explanation. That's where 50's reaction becomes pivotal. Rather than declaring conclusions, he points at the gap. The space between public narratives and private proximity. His framing isn't "this happened." It's "why was this never addressed?" That question lands harder than an accusation because it shifts responsibility. Instead of proving a claim, it asks for integration, a way to reconcile overlapping histories with the stories people were told. Background matters because audiences were trained to accept separation. Faith figures operated above the fray. Entertainment figures operated within it. The documentary challenges that training by suggesting the separation may have been more assumed than examined. When assumptions collapse, trust wobbles, not because of proof, but because of incompleteness. The reaction online reflects that shift. People aren't demanding verdicts, they're demanding context. How do these timelines fit together? Why did these overlaps go unremarked? Why does revisiting them now feel threatening to established narratives? None of those questions accuse. All of them destabilize. And destabilization is exactly why this moment feels bigger than one film. It's not about exposing a secret. It's about exposing a framing choice. What gets highlighted, what gets omitted, and who benefits when worlds aren't examined together. That's the background tension the documentary activates. It asks viewers to reconsider what separate lanes really meant, and whether separation was clarity or convenience. Once that question is on the table, silence becomes noticeable. Responses become measured. Language becomes careful. And the audience starts listening not just to statements, but to what isn't being explained. This is why the story didn't explode immediately. It settled in. People watched, rewatched, compared. And the more they compared, the more they realized the issue wasn't scandal. It was curation. Curation of history, curation of proximity, curation of memory. And when memory is curated, revisiting it, especially on a platform with scale, creates friction that doesn't resolve quickly. That's where we are now. The conflict didn't explode the way people expected. It tightened. That's the first twist. Instead of chaos, accusations, or dramatic rebuttals, what followed the documentary's release was something far more unsettling. Discipline, language became precise. Responses, when they happened at all, were measured to the point of restraint. And restraint in moments like this doesn't calm a story. It signals that everyone understands how sensitive the framing has become. The tension sharpened the moment 50 Cent stopped reacting like a commentator and started acting like a pressure point. He didn't summarize the documentary. He didn't sensationalize it. He focused on the absence, the years, the proximity, the overlapping timelines that had never been publicly addressed in one coherent narrative. That choice changed everything. Because once the conversation moves from "what happened" to "why was this never explained," the burden shifts. It's no longer about defending against claims. It's about accounting for history. And history is harder to manage than rumors. The first real conflict surfaced when viewers noticed something subtle. The documentary didn't need 50's commentary to feel uncomfortable, but his framing made it impossible to ignore. By asking why certain associations were never contextualized, he reframed the entire project from entertainment into interrogation of omission. That's the twist. The documentary itself reportedly avoids conclusions. It lays out sequences, places names and moments near each other, and lets the audience sit with the implications. But when 50 highlighted those implications publicly, the conversation stopped being passive. People weren't just watching anymore, they were evaluating responses. And the responses were telling. No sweeping denials, no detailed explanations, no effort to walk viewers through the historical context in a way that resolved discomfort. Instead, the prevailing tone was caution. Industry observers picked up on it immediately. This wasn't avoidance born of panic, it was containment. The kind of containment used when a story touches multiple power structures at once: faith, entertainment, media, legacy. When that many systems intersect, clarity becomes risky. Here's where the conflict deepens. Viewers began noticing that the strongest defenses weren't factual, they were philosophical. Arguments about unfair scrutiny, about guilt by association, about the danger of conflating proximity with implication. All valid points, but they didn't answer the core question the documentary raised. Why were these overlaps never openly contextualized before? That question doesn't accuse. It demands narrative integration, and integration is exactly what didn't happen. The twist that caught people off guard was how quickly the conversation became about curation rather than conduct. Who decides which parts of a public figure's history are emphasized? Which relationships are highlighted as inspirational and which are left unexamined? When influence spans multiple worlds, who controls how those worlds are presented? That's not a legal issue. It's a credibility issue. And credibility is where the conflict now lives. Insiders say this is why reactions felt restrained rather than defensive. Defensiveness would elevate the documentary's implications. Silence and abstraction, on the other hand, keep the discussion at arm's length, at least temporarily. But temporary strategies don't erase structural questions. As days passed, the audience's attention shifted from the film to the pattern of response. The absence of direct contextualization became more notable than anything shown on screen. People weren't asking for admissions or apologies. They were asking for storytelling coherence. Why now? Why this framing? Why no effort to walk viewers through the overlap calmly and directly? Those questions hardened into the central conflict. And here's the first real twist of power. The documentary no longer needed promotion. It was being discussed not because of its content, but because of the vacuum around it. When a story touches faith, influence, and entertainment simultaneously, silence doesn't neutralize it, it magnifies it. That's when industry voices began saying quietly that this wasn't about exposure. It was about re-examination. Re-examination of eras, of access, of how moral authority and cultural power have intersected without being interrogated publicly. The conflict then isn't personal, it's structural. And once a story becomes structural, it doesn't resolve with a statement. It waits. It watches. It measures how long the silence lasts and what it starts to mean. This is where the narrative tightens rather than explodes. Because now, every future response, or continued lack of one, adds meaning. And meaning, once layered, can't be undone by clarification alone. The escalation didn't arrive with new allegations. It arrived with institutional discomfort, the kind that only surfaces when a story reaches beyond personalities and into systems that prefer not to be named. That's the shocking reveal. Because once the documentary's framing settled in, something subtle but unmistakable happened. The conversation widened without getting louder. Instead of more clips or commentary, there was a noticeable shift in how adjacent institutions responded. Not publicly, privately. Through edits, deferrals, and carefully worded non-answers that signaled the same thing, this moment was being taken seriously. Observers began noticing how quickly the discourse moved from individuals to ecosystems. Viewers weren't just asking about who appeared where and when. They were asking how influence circulates across worlds that claim to operate by different rules. Faith spaces, entertainment spaces, philanthropic spaces, media platforms. The escalation was the realization that these worlds don't just overlap, they share corridors. And corridors are hard to map once people start looking for them. Here's the reveal that changed the temperature. Commentators realized the documentary didn't need to accuse to be consequential. By juxtaposing timelines and proximity, it forced a question no one had prepared to answer cleanly. Who decides when overlap is inspirational and when it's inconvenient? That question isn't about guilt. It's about curation of legitimacy. As the question spread, reactions became more cautious, not because the content was explosive, but because the implications were expansive. Organizations that usually celebrate cross-industry collaboration suddenly spoke in abstractions. Conversations about context replaced conversations about content. And when context becomes the shield, it's because the content is no longer the main risk. The risk is interpretation. Industry analysts noted another escalation point. The documentary's clips began appearing in unexpected conversations, not as proof, but as reference. Remember that sequence? Remember how that was framed? The film became shorthand for a broader unease about how influence has been narrated over time. Once a project becomes shorthand, it has escaped its original boundaries. That's when the reveal sharpened. The most destabilizing development wasn't a statement, it was consensus forming quietly around a single idea. This story isn't asking what happened. It's asking why certain histories were never integrated into the public story. That reframing changed the burden entirely. Integration requires explanation, not denial, and explanation requires choosing what to say, out loud. Silence at this stage became louder. Viewers noticed how carefully responses avoided specifics. No one contested timelines. No one offered a comprehensive walkthrough. Instead, the emphasis stayed on general principles: fairness, privacy, caution. Those are reasonable values, but they don't resolve a narrative gap once the gap has been named. The escalation continued as people began revisiting other moments, unrelated on the surface, that suddenly felt connected by pattern rather than proof. The audience wasn't building a case, it was building a framework. And frameworks are powerful because they organize future information before it arrives. That's the shock. Once a framework exists, every new detail, no matter how benign, gets filtered through it. A platform decision, a speaking appearance, a partnership announcement, all of it now carries subtext, not because of wrongdoing but because of unfinished explanation. Insiders described this phase as a tipping point. The moment a story becomes less about the artifact, the documentary, and more about the expectation it creates. Expectations don't dissipate, they wait. And the expectation here is simple and heavy. At some point, someone will need to integrate the overlaps calmly, directly, and completely, or accept that silence will be read as the chosen interpretation. That's not scandal escalation, it's meaning escalation. The reveal, then, is this. The documentary succeeded without making claims because it reframed how credibility is constructed. It showed that credibility isn't only about actions, it's about what histories are acknowledged and which are left unexamined. And once that door opens, it doesn't slam shut. It creaks wider. What happened next wasn't outrage, it was recalibration. And recalibration is how institutions protect themselves when a story touches more than one pillar at the same time. Media coverage slowed, not because interest dropped, but because word choice tightened. Headlines leaned into neutrality. Panels framed the discussion around context, historical overlap, and audience interpretation. The absence of definitive language was the point. When a story feels structurally sensitive, organizations don't rush to conclusions. They manage exposure. Inside the industry, the reactions were even more telling. Public-facing voices avoided specifics, while private conversations reportedly turned to risk assessment. Advisors recommended restraint. Collaborators deferred comment. Platforms signaled openness to discussion while limiting amplification of fragments that could be misconstrued. None of this looked panicked. It looked practiced. That practice revealed the alignment. When 50 Cent continued to frame the conversation around unanswered history rather than accusations, the tone across coverage subtly followed suit. Not because outlets agreed, but because that framing was harder to refute without explaining something. Explaining, in turn, would require choosing which parts of history to foreground and which to contextualize carefully. That's a delicate decision when faith, entertainment, and legacy intersect. Observers noticed that discussions about T.D. Jakes emphasized principles: privacy, service, and separation of roles, while discussions about Sean Combs emphasized era, influence, and proximity without commentary. The split wasn't accidental. It reflected an industry instinct to keep lanes conceptually separate even when the documentary had placed them side by side. The result: a conversation that acknowledged discomfort without naming its source. Meanwhile, platforms hosting the documentary, most notably Netflix, became part of the reaction whether they commented or not. Analysts noted how the project was positioned, not marketed as an exposé, not defended as a provocation, but allowed to exist as a contextual narrative. That choice insulated the platform while keeping the discussion alive. It was a classic institutional move: provide the frame, avoid the verdict. Fans felt the shift immediately. Instead of demanding answers, they began tracking patterns of response. Who spoke only in generalities, who stayed silent, who emphasized fairness without integration. Comment sections reflected the same refrain: we're not asking for accusations, we're asking for coherence. That refrain mattered because it unified otherwise opposing audiences. Supporters and skeptics found common ground in the idea that overlap deserves explanation, not dismissal. Once that idea took hold, reactions hardened, not into outrage but into expectation. Expectation is heavier than anger. Industry veterans recognize the risk. If expectation persists without resolution, it becomes the lens through which future actions are judged. Every appearance, every partnership, every speaking engagement starts to carry subtext. Not because of what's said, but because of what remains unaddressed. That's why reactions stayed careful. No one wanted to escalate, no one wanted to concede, everyone wanted time. But time doesn't neutralize a reframing once it's been accepted. It only decides how permanent the reframing becomes. By this stage, the conversation had crystallized into a single, unavoidable tension. The difference between separate lanes and shared corridors. The documentary suggested corridors, the reactions defended lanes, and the audience noticed the gap between those positions. That gap is where meaning now lives. And meaning, once it settles, doesn't require new information to persist. It just requires silence to continue. The final twist didn't arrive with a rebuttal or a revelation. It arrived with a realization that quietly locked into place across audiences, media, and industry circles at the same time. This story was never meant to be answered. That's the uncomfortable truth people are starting to sit with. Because by now, it's clear the documentary didn't exist to accuse, and 50 Cent's reaction didn't exist to conclude. Together, they did something far more destabilizing. They changed what people expect explanations for. And once expectations change, silence stops being neutral and starts becoming the message itself. Insiders describe this as the moment when the narrative crossed a line from controversy into historical tension. Up until now, the lack of direct clarification could still be framed as patience, as restraint, as respect for complexity. But as time passes and no effort is made to integrate the overlapping timelines calmly and publicly, a different interpretation begins to harden. That the overlap itself was never meant to be interrogated. That's the twist. Not that something new was revealed, but that something old was finally placed in a position where it could no longer hide behind separation. Faith and entertainment. Moral authority and cultural power. Public guidance and private proximity. The documentary didn't say these things were incompatible. It simply showed that they existed closer together than people were encouraged to believe. And 50's amplification didn't add claims, it added pressure to contextualize. The absence of that context is now doing the loudest talking. Observers note that this phase is where reputational gravity shifts, not through scandal but through unanswered coherence gaps. When audiences sense that a full story exists but is being held back, not denied, not corrected, just withheld, they begin carrying that gap forward into every future interaction. That's where this becomes irreversible, because no future sermon, interview, or appearance will be watched in isolation anymore. Each will be filtered through the same quiet question: where does this fit into the parts of the story we've now seen but not heard explained? That question doesn't demand guilt, it demands integration. And integration is the one thing that hasn't happened. Insiders say this is the stage institutions fear most, not because of backlash, but because of memory formation. Once a moment settles into public memory as the time we notice something didn't add up, it doesn't fade. It becomes a reference point, a footnote, a lens. That's why this feels unresolved in a way that won't dissipate. The cliffhanger isn't about whether someone will speak. It's about whether silence will remain the chosen legacy of this moment. Because silence can do two things. It can protect, or it can confirm that certain histories were never meant to be fully reconciled in public. And the longer silence holds, the more people lean toward the second interpretation, not out of suspicion, but out of pattern recognition. This isn't a story racing toward a dramatic ending. It's a story settling into permanence. The documentary will remain. The reactions will be remembered. And the lack of integration will become the detail people cite, not loudly but consistently. That's the final turn. Not exposure, not accusation, but a reframing of what audiences believe deserves explanation and what happens when that explanation never arrives. The next chapter, if it comes at all, won't come from a film or a post. It will come from a choice: to integrate history openly or to let silence become the definitive interpretation. And once silence wins that role, it never gives it back. Now pause, because this is the point where the audience becomes part of the story, whether anyone wants to admit it or not. This documentary didn't tell you what to think. It told you what to notice. And 50 Cent didn't hand you conclusions. He handed you a question that refuses to go away. Why were these overlaps never explained when they mattered most? That question isn't loud, but it's heavy. And once you carry it, every future appearance, every interview, every carefully chosen word gets filtered through it. So let's talk, really talk. Do you believe this is just coincidence being reframed by editing? Or do you believe silence at this point has become a choice with meaning attached to it? When powerful worlds overlap for years without context, is the public wrong for asking how? And why? That history was curated the way it was. Drop your thoughts in the comments, but don't rush them. This isn't about sides. It's about standards. About whether credibility in 2026 is built on statements or on the willingness to integrate uncomfortable history when it resurfaces. If you noticed how the conversation shifted from what happened to what was omitted, hit that like button. If you think silence can sometimes speak louder than denial, make sure you're subscribed. And if you want to be first when the next moment forces this conversation back into the open, turn on notifications now. Because here's the truth most people won't say out loud. Stories like this don't end when the credits roll. They end when the audience decides silence is no longer neutral. And once that line is crossed, every future move by anyone involved gets read differently. Not louder, deeper. We'll be here watching the pauses, tracking the language, noting what gets integrated and what stays missing. Stay sharp, stay curious, and remember, when history is finally placed side by side, the most powerful reactions aren't always the loudest ones. Sometimes they're the ones that never come at all.